Wasn't this the area that we anticipated that there'd be more resistance?
I mean, we're here in Baghdad. The buildings are, 4 and 5 stories high.
Wow.
This is Baghdad.
You're in Baghdad.
And I'm standing in Baghdad. This is not Stalingrad.
Are you seeing are we getting a lot of casualties against them, Colonel? Are we inflicting?
Yeah, we probably evacuated, I don't know, I lost count, maybe 35 or 40 guys yesterday. And in fact, taken several pictures and signed autographs and, the usual thing when Ollie North's there. And then sat down in one of the troop seats and we evacuated him. I thought he was wounded in the hand.
Wow.
It turns out he was gut shot. But the heroism of these guys is just...
It's remarkable.
It's extraordinary. Begged to go home with me. I'll try to put one up on I think the world saw me trying to put...
I think we're not a great phone connection there with Ollie.
I thought, well, there's a couple.
Losing him.
I think we may be losing him. I know his cell phone was weak, so
right.
if we can get him back, if we can get him back, we will.
You can't help but be proud and inspired when you see what some of these guys are doing under fire. And we would not be seeing all that without embedded journalists until the history of the war was done some years ago, some years from now, that is, by the Pentagon, and people might have questions about the veracity of it. Just seeing what the embedded journalists have been able to do has got to be inspirational to all Americans watching these young men and women.
I feel the same way, and I just remarkable. We heard Ollie North just a few minutes ago talking about being in a helicopter it's being shot at.
This commander wants to thank the American people and President Biden for providing a weapon that is helping Ukraine stay in the fight.
Oh, Lockheed Martin, I've heard of them somewhere. I wonder how much money they made this year.
And that's why their message to their allies is unchanged.
So CNN there are just presenting essentially a commercial for Lockheed Martin and their products, dressing it up as aid to the Ukrainian struggle.
Please send more weapons now.
Don't worry, more weapons are coming. That's the news.
So I had been beaten up by a woman cop, black woman cop in New York City, totally racist. This is exactly, like to the T, exactly what she did to me. And there were no cameras, that's why I bought a camera after that. Went through the subway without paying. I was afraid of the police. It had just happened the year before this. And so I was voting. This was in Saugerties, New York. And that's a whole other story. This was like a collage of so many things. But the scene where I was voting, this was just the beginning of something I was throwing together. There's also a shot of the old election booth. And the name of a funny old German name running for sheriff, which I think was the Democrat. And I was a Democrat. I'm always an independent, but I was voting Democrat probably at the time. And I think I just didn't vote for that one. But I asked them about it, and they got really pissed. So I took out my camera to basically document that. There it is. And they got really angry, and they were escorting me out. There's more to that, but just real quick. The woman... she said, "Do you want the police to come here?" I should have said yes, but I thought she was threatening to arrest me. So I was really fucked in the head for quite a long time after that happened to me. And, yeah. I'd just gotten the camera, and I was just as nervous about using it, and I was afraid somebody was going to grab it out of my hands. So, thus the horrible camera work. People didn't play around back then. People wanted to kill you if you had a camera. And so I was just as nervous thinking about they're calling the police on me, and now I'm going to be arrested for doing something like some federal offense, filming in an election place. And there were no laws like that at the time, I'm pretty sure. And I mean, the thing is
cut it too short, because
those are 20 witnesses. And I even did go to the Board of Elections, and they told me I would have to get an attorney, and it would cost money, just to report what I'd seen.
Why would I want the police to come here?
Either false flag or
30 years ago, nobody gave a shit about police brutality, and nobody gave a shit about elections. in a situation like that. You were a crazy person.
Racist people like you deserve to suffer and die. You might as well be dead. Your career is over. Just watch.
And I feel your pain as a non-white person.
Some loving parents might send their child to traverse Mexico alone.
Okay, let me tell you something. Let's get real. Let me go get my people from Mount Vernon, from the Bronx, from Brooklyn, and come up here and terrorize this town to let you see what it's going to be if you don't fix what you done damaged. Okay, because these brothers and sisters out here are doing very well. These kids are outstanding. They're not out here breaking in people's houses. They're not vandalizing your porch. They ain't beat up your kids yet. They ain't did nothing to do anything out of ordinary. Okay? These police have enough
To reach the southern border, our southern border. I hope they don't undertake that perilous journey, but if they do,
now they see how we feel when we have to worry about where we're going to live tomorrow, because you can't even go downstairs and talk to Section 8 about giving us an opportunity to get Section 8 to get out of that low budget housing.
we will not expel that young child. We will care for that young child and unite that child with a responsible parent. That is who we are as a nation, and we can do it.
All right, Secretary Mayorkas, the conversation will continue. We thank you very much this morning.
If two black people killed a police officer, they would instantly become heroes.
Yeah.
Officer Wilbert Mora was taken off life support yesterday, 4 days after he and his partner were ambushed during a domestic disturbance call.
Because if we don't look like the community we serve, how can that community trust us?
If the police could recognize that, look, black people call the police more than any other group.
Keep the poor out your mama! Keep the poor out your mama! Keep the poor out! Keep the poor out your mama! Keep the poor out your mama! Keep the poor out! Keep the poor out your mama! Keep the poor out your mama! Keep the poor out! Keep the poor out your mama! Keep the
Wouldn't you prefer a world in which diplomatic solutions were being sought by these major superpowers? Because we do not benefit from these conflicts. It has ever been thus. Economically, interest will benefit from these conflicts. You won't. The CNN report said that for the US military, the war has become an incredible source of data on the utility of its own systems. For example, the US has seen that its HIMARS rocket launch system has been effective against Russian forces.
Because if I just say that they're shutting off the world food supply, then I sound crazy.
Somebody walks into Texas or Arizona unvaccinated, they're allowed to stay. Why?
But that's not how it works. We actually know.
You know that that's not what you guys want to happen, but that is what's happening.
But that's not. It's not like somebody walks over and that's not how.
Exactly what's happening.
The border is secure, but we also have a broken immigration system.
That's not how.
Exactly what's happening.
The border is secure.
For more information,
Ukraine, and we want defeat for Vladimir Putin.
For more information or to find a flu shot location, visit nyc.gov/flu or call 311.
I think that everybody should go and get the shot. It's a little shot. It takes 2 seconds. It doesn't hurt.
Regime change would be great, but we realize that that will not happen, but defeat must happen.
Rape should not take place anywhere. If it's in a park or if it's on the street.
But my dad put his money where his mouth was. He'd always hire the black doctor, the black accountant, the black plumber, and often he'd have something we call black regret.
So, assuming his legal problems are all cleared away in the next year or two, I think that's when we can really start talking about whether or not Brian Benjamin is going to be back in public life.
If this is appealing to you, just think of this when you think of vaccination. Vaccination.
You already know, Joe. Of course not. This is white privilege on steroids.
You're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations.
A few weeks ago, listening to Senator Johnson, who suggested pretty sort of transparently that there was a correlation between those who got vaccinated and post-vaccination deaths, noting that 5,000 deaths that were reported on the adverse event system happened 1 or 2 or 3 days following a vaccination, suggesting that there was a correlation. I'll ask this to Dr. Walensky. Is there any increased risk of death to individuals who get a vaccine? Is there any data to back up the claim that Senator Johnson was making, that there's some correlation between risk of death and vaccination? Isn't it exactly the opposite?
For COVID, it is, in fact, exactly the opposite. Our vaccine adverse event system collects all deaths after vaccination. That means if you were hit in a motor vehicle accident and succumbed to that event, that would be reported in our vaccine safety system. Clearly, that is not a causal effect from a vaccine. And yes, these vaccines are working to prevent death from COVID-19.
Here for reaction, author of The Giant Awakens, retired Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North.
And your support is crucial, not just to stand in such fight, but to get to the turning point to win on the battlefield.
Not one penny.
There has been testimony, as I'm sure you're aware, that a death benefit account was set up by Mr. Hakeem with the name Button for the benefit of your family in the event of your death. Were you aware of any such account?
No.
We have artillery. Yes. Thank you. We have it. Is it enough? Honestly, not really.
Colonel, thanks for joining us. You know, there are some people that are concerned that, $110 billion.
I do want to make one point clear. I did at one point express concern somewhere after I'd met Mr. Hakeem and the financial network that had been established. I did at some point express concern to General Secord, suppose both you guys go down on the same airplane, what happens then? And I was told, don't worry about it. Arrangements will be made so that these operations can continue. But nobody ever told me that a single penny was set aside for my purposes, for my benefit whatsoever.
Is that money well spent? $110 billion. The American people aren't seeing that kind of money. It's coming out of their pockets. Well, it's coming out of all of our pockets, but it's money well spent, in my humble opinion.
And I never heard of buttons or belly buttons until these hearings began.
This is very much like what Ronald Reagan did back in the 80s, and I do have some experience with that. I know that makes me a lot older than most of our viewers.
This is Iran. But it's also important you understand that it was always the intention to make this a self-sustaining operation, and that there always be something there which you could reach out and grab when you needed it. As Director Casey said, you want something you can pull off the shelf and use on a moment's notice.
But in fact, he believed in supporting freedom fighters.
Conclude by commending the President of the United States, who tried valiantly to recover our citizens and achieve an opening for the strategically vital Iran.
He did it in Latin America. He did it in Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique. He did it in Afghanistan. Those people were willing, as the Ukrainian people are, to use their blood and our bullets.
I mean, I wanted them involved, but I didn't want to be on record as doing it.
It has ever been thus. Economically, interest will benefit from these conflicts. You won't. The CNN report said that for the US military, the war has become an incredible source of data on the utility of its own systems. For example, the US has seen that its HIMARS rocket launch system has been effective against Russian forces. Hey, that's a very effective rocket. Look, we've killed all those Russians. Oh, what are they doing now? Oh, they're telling Putin. And what's he doing? Oh, he's going behind his desk. And what's that button he's going to press? Oh, this is a real triumph. The war in Ukraine has also created a demand for weapons that were beginning to become obsolete, such as the Stinger shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles. Fire sale! Everything must go! Over-the-shoulder missile launchers, now at half price! It's really, essentially, Walmart, but for weapons. But not only that, Raytheon stopped producing Stingers for years, but now has been asked by the Pentagon to ramp up production as thousands have been shipped to Ukraine. Let's see how the mainstream media covers this contentious issue of arms sales and spending billions of dollars of taxpayer revenue on a war that could lead to a global conflagration. I expect it will be balanced and transparent.
A secret location, a precious weapon.
Fetishizing the weapon. A precious weapon. Look at you, baby.
The High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, or HIMARS, a powerful gift from the United States to Ukraine.
A powerful gift, a sexy weapon. It's going to be so good to get that radioactive rain tumbling onto my face, knowing it was such a sexy phallic missile that provoked the conflict.
So far, they've only received 4 of these launches, but the scorch marks on the Earth show they've been busy.
When I see a scorch mark on the Earth, I think, yay, we've been busy, baby. Hopefully, if they get the maximum number of weapons possible, the whole Earth will be one bloody great big scorch mark. Brilliant.
The operators say its accuracy and range, about 44 miles, allows them to hit important sites deep inside Russian-controlled territory. The local pro-Russian forces were in no doubt. Only Ukraine's new HIMARS could have done this.
In a sense, you shouldn't be fetishizing war and conflict. Ukrainian people are dying, Russian people are dying. I believe that no one is ultimately benefiting from this except for the most elite interests in the world.
In another sign of the HIMARS' ability to influence this war, Ukrainian leaders can't stop saying thank you. No other donated weapon has inspired so much public gratitude.
Donated weapon. The language around this is a profitable endeavour that allows the West to test pilot weapons that they may be able to use in future conflicts. Of course they want to present that as humanitarian aid. Of course they want CNN puff pieces. The Ukrainians say, oh, thank you. But this is something that is contentious and dangerous and requires responsibility, not only with the decisions that are made, but the way that we are informed about the nature of those decisions.
This commander wants to thank the American people and President Biden for providing a weapon that is helping Ukraine stay in the fight.
Oh, Lockheed Martin, I've heard of them somewhere. I wonder how much money they made this year.
And that's why their message to their allies is unchanged.
So CNN there are just presenting essentially a commercial for Lockheed Martin and their products, dressing it up as aid to the Ukrainian struggle.
Please send more weapons now.
Don't worry, more weapons are coming. That's the news. Lockheed Martin announced recently that it plans to expand its production of the High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, better known as HIMARS, or HIMARS, by more than 50%. So it's a good job that there's a commercial right in the middle of the news saying that we need more of them. The decision follows months of positive publicity for the weapons system on the news, which seems to have sparked increased interest from governments in Eastern Europe. Of course it does. That's propaganda. That's the function of propaganda. The announcement comes just a month after the Army said it wanted to double HIMARS production and triple production of certain types of artillery in response to the war in Ukraine. This type of boost would require new or at least dramatically expanded production facilities, raising concerns that it will be difficult to scale back down in the future. Hopefully we can have another war then. Keep production just rolling on. Large defence companies are already seeing their share prices go up as investors anticipate the impact of the war on profits. As of June 2022, Lockheed Martin has seen an increase of 14%. Of course they have. They've got CNN on board doing news broadcasts that essentially highlight the demand for their product as a pious endeavour. Jack Reed, Democrat, and Jim Inhofe, Republican, recently proposed a new amendment to this year's National Defence Authorization Act. The proposal would give the Department of Defense wartime powers that would free it to buy huge amounts of artillery and other munitions using multi-year contracts. Of course, we mention that to highlight that whether you are pro-Democrat or pro-Republican, you are pro the military-industrial complex, you are pro your tax dollars being spent on this war. And again, let me iterate that supporting Ukrainian people, ending this conflict should be an absolute priority. The message that patriotism and profits for the military-industrial complex are one fused idea is a propagandist one. I believe what's best for Ukrainian people is a peaceful solution as soon as possible. This amendment will mean that they don't have to vote on it, no one has to talk about it. Essentially, your money can be funneled directly into Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. That's exactly what they want to be able to tell their shareholders. The amendment would also authorise the Pentagon to skip competitive contracting for Ukraine-related deals, including billions of dollars worth of contracts to refill US stockpiles. And it would waive other provisions aimed at stopping weapons makers from overcharging taxpayers. So they're going to be able to set their own prices, there won't be competition, all these ideas. Remember how often, if you hear sort of what you might regard as socialist rhetoric, no, entrepreneurialism, capitalism, free market competition, this is what generates ingenuity. Well, we're going to be really taking a hit on the ingenuity here because they're not competing, they're not signing it off, and they're not having to account for their expenditure. There is also legislation pending in Congress that indicates that the US government believes the Ukraine war may continue for years. Fingers crossed. On October the 11th, the Senate Armed Services Committee submitted its amended draft of the National Defence Authorization Act for 2023. Nestled within the draft is a provision that would establish an emergency multi-year plan to award massive defence contracts to Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, BAE Systems and other war corporations to produce weapons for Ukraine and to replenish US stockpiles as well as those of foreign allies and partners. So, whether or not it's this war or future wars, there is kind of a policy and an intention to continue with conflict in order to service these kind of deals. Congress is supportive of this. They're going to give us multi-year authority and they're going to give us funding to really put into the industrial base. And I'm talking billions of dollars into the industrial base to fund these production lines, said the Pentagon's chief weapons buyer, Bill LaPlante. And Bill LaPlante is an accurate name because he's been planted there by a corrupt system. So when we're talking about this war, we're talking about this conflict and we're focusing on Putin's brutality and endless array of diseases and Russia's criminal invasion, all of which is true, and the suffering of Ukrainian people, certainly true. It is operating as a veil to prevent us seeing that, much like the pandemic, this situation is highly beneficial.
And by the way, most of that 110 billion total between the 45, the 1.7, and the previous 65 over 110 billion is spent here in the United States. It's provided to contractors and defense logisticians and the kinds of people who build the kinds of systems that we're getting. So most of that money is spent here in America. Good, hardworking Americans have the jobs. And when you look at that kind of an investment, and it's just not a plug for this book, the idea of it is to make sure that they get the right message and to make sure that Putin gets the right message. No more invasions. And that means the people in Taiwan are going to need the same kinds of weapon systems that we're now providing to the Ukrainians. And we better get hot at it because the Communist Chinese aren't backing down, but they're watching very carefully what we're doing. And so, Jason, in my humble opinion, this is money well spent. And it's expensive stuff. The Patriot batteries themselves are very expensive. When you look at each one of the Patriot PAC-3 missiles, literally weigh comes in well over $1 billion a battery and $1 million a missile. So you're trying to shoot at stuff that's being flown by Putin as he's trying to redraw the boundaries of Europe. A Patriot battery, 1.5 billion. Each Patriot missile, 4 million. The max range about 100 miles. So the Iranians Shahed drones, 80-pound warhead, 25K apiece. That's what we're up against. And he's got volleys and volleys of them that they're firing at infrastructure in the dead of winter.
Colonel, the concern is that Vladimir Putin turns this suddenly into World War III. You're familiar with Putin. Does this provoke him in such a way that it gives him a justification to escalate war and take it outside the bounds of Ukraine?
Look, he's been rattling the nuclear saber since all of this, before all this began on the 24th of February. And Putin does this routinely. And in my humble opinion, I don't think Vladimir Putin could fire a nuclear weapon anywhere in Europe. I think there have been so many mutinies in his armed forces. There are some people who are just not going to push the button. They're not going to go to the right place with that missile launch system. Their permissive action link program is entirely different than ours. That weapon has to be in the right place to be fired at a very specific target. And his pilots are not going to fly their weapons. The downside, from my opinion, the downside of the Patriot batteries is they're only sending one. The maximum range for a Patriot missile is about 100 miles, okay? And there's a minimum range because you don't want it going off right over your head. And if Vladimir Putin puts his hypersonic weapons on an aircraft that's over Russia, are they going to authorize the launch of a Patriot missile into Russia? I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that need to be worked out in this thing. Not only the training time it takes to make sure that folks can do it. Sure, and uncertain things always happen in war. Been there, done that.
Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, thank you for joining us tonight on Hannity. Do appreciate it.
What do you make of this threat of an unconventional attack by the information minister earlier today? He says it's not chemical or biological or nuclear, but can we trust them? I don't believe them.
That's been proven time and time again, and I think everything they say is suspect.
NBC, I know for one, has reported the discovery by our Marines of large concentrations of cyanide agent and mustard agents in the Euphrates River. Fox is reporting U.S. troops found thousands of boxes of suspicious white powder, nerve agent antidote, Arabic documents on how to engage in chemical warfare south of Baghdad. My question of you is, those people that have not supported the effort and raised questions about the president and his diplomacy efforts, said that 1441 wasn't enough, we needed to give him more time. Will they be embarrassed when we find all these weapons of mass destruction?
Documented.
I think a lot of liberals will be embarrassed too, along with Jimmy Carter. These are former presidents breaking the tradition of criticizing those that follow after them. Clinton predicted prior to this war, quote, "This war is going to be over in a flash." And you're looking at a couple of weeks of bombing, and I'd be astonished if this campaign took more than a week. The administration took a very different tact, from the president to Don Rumsfeld to Dick Cheney, Condi Rice. They're all on record saying it would take a longer period of time, and they prepared the American people for a long endeavor.
It's going to turn out to be a little more difficult than we were led to believe. But in fact, the regime did not implode. Shock and awe did not awe them. And we had to win this the old-fashioned way.
Congressman,
this thing is going relatively well, but not as well as relatively well.
You got to be kidding.
Let me bring on Congressman Truck here. President Clinton were critical before the war started. The actual was critical before the war started, and when he made his unfortunate comments, he didn't know the war was starting 24 to 48 hours later. Wouldn't you agree, Congressman Truck, that pretty much we've banded together? Democrats have been relatively mute about being critical of this administration, and we haven't had this kind of catfighting we normally have in Washington, correct?
Yes, Alan, yeah, I think you're right. Before the war, they were doing that. There's no question about that. But since the war began, there has been very little of that, and I think a lot of that is due to the Pentagon briefing, first of all, briefing members of Congress and the Senate every day, and then Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Myers, coming about once a week or so, because that keeps everybody up to speed, and I think that keeps the rhetoric level low, and I think that's a good thing.
Also, in terms of weapons of mass destruction, I don't know anybody was suggesting that they wouldn't find any or that there weren't any. I think the suggestion on those who didn't want the war just yet was that more time with more inspections might have eventually averted a war, but I don't think anybody said we wouldn't find any. Are you surprised, though, that we've not found much of anything along those lines so far.
Nobody at the White House, nobody at the Pentagon ever said this was going to be quick. They had a plan that they're following through with, and they're going to take it till the end. The president's made it very clear. This war will go as long as it takes to get the job done.
I think some very people in the administration, Kenneth Edelman, who's an advisor, was an advisor to Reagan, Dick Cheney, basically gave us a sense that this might not take long at all. Was that your sense of things as well?
Well, I think there was a range of opinion out there, and I think that many of the strongest supporters of the war, and many with connections to the administration, were implying that this regime might very well cave, and it may have come close to caving, but instead it is battling us to the best of its, thank God, limited ability, and hopefully will be successful in the coming weeks.
How do you see us making the peace after the war, Congressman Sherman?
We were very successful in Japan and Germany in a multi-year process in changing those societies, and we may need just as long in Iraq.
Let me, Mr. Sherman, let me just point out a couple of things here. Every single administration official, president, the vice president, Rumsfeld, Condi Rice, everybody said that this was going to be difficult, it would take a long time, and they prepared the American people well. And the second thing is Robert Byrd, John Kerry, Nancy Pelosi, all these leading Democrats after, for the record now, after the war started, made their horrible comments. Now, just before Alan got up, you mentioned relatively successful. The first Gulf War, sir, it took 6 weeks. Afghanistan took 9. Kosovo took 11. In 2 weeks, we have 75% of the country, 100% of the air. We're right on the outskirts of Baghdad with very fewer casualties than any other effort I can think of. And you say relatively successful. What do you mean by that?
Well, my comments actually reflect those of the American people who were polled, I believe, just yesterday, and a large minority.
What poll?
I don't have that poll with me.
I never heard. All the polls show 80% of the people think it's going very well and support the president and think he's doing the right thing.
Half say very well, and another large group say, and another large group say well.
Fox News, Washington Post, ABC, Gallup, they all basically say the same.
You're adding together the well and the very well, and I said it was going relatively well. I would count myself in that second group.
Where is it not going well in 2 weeks? Because there's never been a military effort where we've come so far, so fast, with so few casualties. Name one.
We have come to judge our whether the war is going well by new standards, perhaps caused by our success against Milosevic, which was accomplished with virtually no American casualties.
And how many weeks was that?
That took longer than this one has so far. But keep in mind, a lot fewer American casualties.
Hey, you know what it seems to me, and I'm going to be very blunt here, Congressman, because we have a lot of leading members of your party attacking the president, as we started this segment out with.
Nothing compared to what Clinton was up with during the Kosovo War. Nothing compared to the vicious attacks.
I know, you said that 40 times. I'm done hearing it. A lot of you Democrats, you can't seem to put your partisanship aside and your antipathy for the president and admit, by golly, he has done a pretty great job here. Why can't you have enough decency?
I said the war is going relatively well. I voted, unlike the majority of my party, to empower this president to undertake diplomatic and, if necessary, military action. And I'm known as one of the people in my party who strongly believes we've got to prevent Saddam from having nuclear weapons.
Gentlemen,
so where you get off calling me some sort of extreme partisan when you're unwilling to talk about
comments,
what we're up
I got to break because but you didn't have the decency tonight to even criticize Kerry today, but you came in with your partisan, talking points, and that's what I was referring to.
3 times criticize Mr. Kerry. I just didn't do it as strongly as you wanted me to.
Mr. Schrock, you get the final word tonight.
Well, I really believe this war is going well. Whenever you do an operations plan for a war, things are going to change probably on an hourly, a daily basis. A few casualties, granted, 1 casualty is 1 too many. But we've had very few casualties when you consider the action we've taken and the amount of country we have conquered. If we continue the way we're going, this should be a low casualty war. And I think the president, his defense team, Condoleezza Rice, all of them will be congratulated on a job well done. And we just have to make sure we continue to support them to bring some freedom to Iraq.
We now get an update from the front lines. Colonel Oliver North, embedded with the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force. And Ollie joins us by phone. What can you tell us, Ollie? How are things going from your end? What can you tell us from your observation point?
Alan, I'm sorry I can't join you by video phone like I usually do, but batteries being what they are and this operation going the way it has, unfortunately I can't. Yesterday was the toughest day of fighting for the 5th Marines since this battle began. Yesterday we evacuated some 35 Marine casualties, at least with the helicopters I've been with. Unfortunately, some of those Marines didn't make it. The helicopter I was on took a lot of small arms fire. One of them clipped a fuel line, and unfortunately we had to set down in what one of the troops described as Indian country. And these remarkable Marines fixed the helicopter under fire and picked it back up and got these Marines to the hospital. It is going very, very well. There's no doubt about the outcome. It's just taking a little bit longer than people thought.
Hey, Colonel Sean Hannity, it sounds like you guys had a very busy time there. When the small arms fire was coming at your helicopter, it actually cut one of the fuel lines right there, and you dropped down. And while they were fixing it, I just want to make sure I understood you completely, they were under fire then?
Yeah, I mean, these guys are absolutely astounding. There's a gunnery sergeant who I actually featured in one of my pieces that I sent in just before the war started, Gunnery Sergeant Pennington, who took a line out of one of the other older parts of the airplane that wasn't being used. It's from a heater. Cut the heater line,
right.
Replaced the fuel line with the heater line, under fire, put the thing back together, and we flew the casualties to the surgical center.
Let me ask you, were the guys that you're with, Colonel, were they surprised? Because, look, we're now within a stone's throw of Baghdad, northwest and south, as you've been saying, more territory, faster, with fewer casualties than any other prior effort, which I've been pointing out as well. Were you surprised by the resistance? Wasn't this the area that we anticipated that there'd be more resistance?
I mean, we're here in Baghdad. The buildings are, 4 and 5 stories high.
Wow.
This is Baghdad.
You're in Baghdad.
And I'm standing in Baghdad. This is not Stalingrad.
Right.
This is not leveling the city to save it from the bad guys.
Are you seeing a lot of? Are we getting a lot of casualties against them, Colonel? Are we inflicting?
Yeah, we probably evacuated. I don't know. I lost count. Maybe 35 or 40 guys yesterday, and in fact, taken several pictures and signed autographs and the usual thing when Holly North's there. And then sat down in one of the troop seats, and we evacuated him. I thought he was wounded in the hand.
Wow.
It turns out he was gut shot. And when we got to the surgical center, he passed out as I was helping him out of the bird. And there was a terrible big puddle of blood underneath him. And I said, Gunny, why didn't you say something? He said, the other guys were hurt worse than I was.
Wow.
Now, he's going to make it. He's going to make it. I've talked to the doc. He's going to make it. But the heroism of these guys is just...
It's remarkable.
It's extraordinary. It
Ollie,
really is, Sean.
We've been hearing stories about, how there's this imaginary red ring around Baghdad, past which would be chemical weapons. And I just wonder if, is that a concern? Have you seen any evidence of that? And of course, we heard them say that Iraq said it would conducting an unconventional act at some point around now. Have you seen any evidence of that?
Alan, I think we're in, I've got to go talk to General Mattis again and find out, but I think we're inside this imaginary red ring. I think we've actually been inside it now for 48 hours, and certainly here in the eastern entrance of Baghdad, we're inside it. If he used a chemical weapon against the leading elements of the troops I'm with right now, he'd kill thousands of civilians. It's not going to have much effect on the U.S. Marines, and I doubt seriously that it would on the Army, because I think they, just like we are, walking around in these NBC suits. I mean, we're even wearing the rubber booties, although I notice I've worn a hole in the bottom of mine.
Yeah.
The rubber shoes, we've got the full suits on, we've got the gas mask on our side, I've got my gloves tucked in my belt, just in case, one of these alarms goes off, and there's one of those alarms with every one of these companies. And I've got one about 10 feet from me. Dragged your girl home with me. I'll try to put one up on I think the world saw me trying to put...
I think we're not a great phone connection there with Ollie.
I thought, there's a couple.
Losing him.
I think we may be losing him. I know his cell phone was weak, so if we can get him back... if we can get him back, we will. One of the things he said that was most interesting here, as we check in just a second with one of our military experts, is that they are in Baghdad. It's not Stalingrad, which was one of the fears that they had, and that we destroyed a big part of the Iraqi Guard. We're joined now for the latest, retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel Bill Cowan. Bill, Ali's report, in Baghdad, no Stalingrad. We had knocked out a big portion of these Republican Guard troops that so many of us had feared prior to the beginning of this conflict. And really, Saddam didn't want the Republican Guard close to Baghdad because he didn't trust them.
You know, Ali, I mean, we're amazed. This is the first reports really we've heard here of being inside the city. It won't be a Stalingrad because we're not going to level the city. We're going to be cautious as we move through, not only taking care of our troops, but trying to minimize the effect on the civilian population as we fight our way.
You know, immediately all of us thought that this is it. This is the moment. They're even telegraphing that they're going to use chemical weapons. But according to Ali's report, that's not even really feasible right now.
Well, they could use it, Sean. I think Ali said it is feasible, but if they do it, they're going to inflict thousands upon thousands of casualties upon civilians.
Is that
indeed,
possible?
And probably have very... Well, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, if they fire those chemical weapons against our front lines there, our guys are all protected. None of the civilians are.
If they, in fact, have those weapons of mass destruction, that's got to be a big fear for our guys.
Yeah, you know, Sean, as we push forward, as those frontline Marine units or Army, as they move in, as those kids push forward, you've got to clear every building. You've got to check every building you've gone by to make sure that there's nobody in there. Because as an example, if our front lines push forward and there are 22 blocks inside the city and somebody's hiding back there at block 10 with a weapon of mass destruction, our forces are coming through thinking it's a secure area, and somebody pops up and pops out some kind of chemical weapon, as an example. We've got a real problem because we've got some disarray there behind our front lines, and you know, we're going to make it through it, we're going to handle it, but it's just an issue that you don't want to have to deal with. So as Ollie would tell you, as we move forward through all these blocks, block by block through the city, we have to check every last building, every room, every basement, every attic, and make sure that it's safe. And that's the only thing I can come up with is random acts of terrorism committed here and there. I think he was specifically talking about the airport. He said it was going to happen at night, and the night's about to end, fortunately, so maybe there won't be anything. But we know over the long run that those guys are going to want to use terrorist acts of various sorts. It really makes it, you know, our troops are fighting a conventional war out there in the front lines, and at the same time, they're having to watch carefully. They might see civilians that they want to help, as we've had happen.
One of the fears I have is that just when we think this could be over or close to over, whenever that time comes, and we think everything is calm and settled, that there's some kind of attack that we didn't plan on, or they start to do something after there's some relative peace. Is that something we have? It's
going to happen, Alan. No, you're absolutely right. It's going to happen no matter what. We're going to have some hardcore guys in there, even if they're Special Republican Guard or some of that special security force that he has. There's still going to be pockets in there, days, maybe even weeks after most of this has settled down. Saddam's gone, interim government is in, and there's going to be incidents happening because there'll always be some hardliners that are going to hide out and take advantage of an opportunity.
So how do we know when this is over?
Well, that's a good question, because I know the White House is saying we could declare victory and still have Saddam out there, and maybe that's so. I think part of it has to be, as we look beyond the victory here, we have to look at the perceptions around the rest of the Middle East. And if indeed Saddam is still around, we might perceive that we've won. The rest of the Arab world perceives that we haven't. So I think, you know, getting Saddam out of the way is an important mission we have to do.
All right, Colonel, stay tight right there. One of the things I want to ask you, Colonel, when we get back, I'm going to show you video of Saddam Hussein from earlier today. I want to know whether or not you think that's him. We'll compare it to some other video. Later, we're going to raise the question whether or not Senator John Kerry should apologize for his comments about needing regime change here in America. So we'll get that controversy in there, and we will have that debate. That's all coming up. But first, we're going to get a news update from Jane Skinner. She's standing by for the very latest headlines on Operation Iraqi Freedom and Fox Central.
Thanks, Sean, and hello, everybody. And here is the latest on Operation Iraqi Freedom. In just the past hour, more explosions have been seen lighting up the Baghdad skyline, and machine gun fire has been echoing through the center of that city. Some of that seemed to be coming from the southern end of the old presidential palace complex. Earlier, the Iraqi information minister promised American forces would soon see an unconventional surprise, but he said it would not involve biological or chemical weapons. Well, after seizing the city's airport, Allied troops have given it a new name. It is now called Baghdad Airport. Tunnels built under the terminals are being searched by U.S. soldiers. The military will now use the airport as a base. U.S. Marines are gathering on the outskirts of Baghdad, getting ready for a final push, and all the while artillery has been pounding Republican Guard positions near the capital. We're told about 2,500 young Iraqi men surrendered to the Marines today, who paused their advance long enough to set up a makeshift POW camp. Arab TV channel Al Jazeera is showing two women, it says, vowed to commit suicide bombings in Iraq. The network claims these women are responsible for a car bombing outside Baghdad today that killed 3 Army Rangers. It was the second such attack since the war began. And on the northern front, huge explosions rock the city of Mosul as fighting goes on between coalition and Iraqi forces there. Kurdish Peshmerga fighters in the north have now joined coalition forces, and Turkish trucks are bringing in supplies for U.S. troops. We'll have more headlines for you coming up in the next hour. Hannity and Holmes will continue next right here on Fox.
Thank you, Jane. Did presidential hopeful Senator John Kerry cross the line when he called for regime change in the U.S.? We'll debate it. First, Colonel Cowan and I keep hearing about these this unconventional attack, and we heard what happened at the checkpoint, which I think is akin to an act of terrorism. I want to talk to you about the death of Michael Kelly, a journalist with The Atlantic. Is that going to lead to a reevaluation of the issue of embedded journalists?
Well, I hope not. I hope not, Alan. I think this whole embedded journalist thing has been wonderful for two reasons. Well, the primary reason being that America really sees these incredible young men and women out on the front lines. You can't help but be proud and inspired when you see what some of these guys are doing under fire. And we would not be seeing all that without embedded journalists until the history of the war was done some years ago, some years from now, that is, by the Pentagon, and people might have questions about the veracity of it. Just seeing what the embedded journalists have been able to do has got to be inspirational to all Americans watching these young men and women.
I feel the same way, and I just remarkable. We heard Ollie North just a few minutes ago talking about being in a helicopter it's being shot at, and then unfortunately, the death of Michael Kelly, which I think brings home for us that if you're going to be an embedded journalist, you're at risk to a great extent, and you're not armed.
No question
Unlike
about
the
it,
troops
Alan.
you're embedded with, you don't have any arms.
No, you're right. And in fact, watching Greg Kelly a few times and Rick Leventhal right up there where there was shooting going on, I think it was Rick that took a little bit of shrapnel or something in his face. No question.
That was
it's
great.
a dangerous job, and unfortunately, Michael Kelly was killed in an accident. He or any other one, there are others of these embedded journalists, could have been killed in actual combat.
How do we declare victory if Baghdad is not taken?
We're not in a hurry to do this. We're going to take a little bit of time. We may indeed try and divide that city into two pieces. And if that happens reasonably soon, then we've started to isolate Saddam and those who support him. Absolutely, Sean. In fact, I think yesterday a real piece of significant news that didn't seem to get too much attention was the fact that the Grand Ayatollah, and his name is Sistani, the leading Shiite cleric in all of the country, put out a fatwa, a religious edict, telling his people to basically support the coalition forces. I mean, that was not a small thing. That was a big, big thing, and it really may mean the difference between how fast a lot of the Shiites roll to our side.
And I've got to tell you, I'm not a professional. I just play one on TV, but there's no comparison. Obviously, we've heard all the reports that he has these body doubles, multiple body doubles. When I look at this, I don't see Saddam. What do you see?
Well, Sean, I don't know, and I know you all see him on the air all the time as you're doing various shows. I've not watched it that carefully, but in watching this today and thinking about whether Saddam is dead or alive, I've come to the personal conclusion that I hope he's alive, and indeed I hope we catch him, and I hope in doing so we then turn him over to the Iraqi people for some kind of legal action, because when the rest of the Arab world, and that's, when we're all done with Iraq here, we've got the rest of the Arab world that we're dealing with in one fashion or another. If the rest of the Arab world sees the Iraqis put this guy on trial and talk about all the things he's done to them, that sends a clear message that indeed, as we know, we were right from the start.
Well, that is all coming, and I think the weapons of mass destruction will be found. I don't think we have any doubt about that. What are we to make of
none whatsoever, Sean.
What are we to make of the reports that they've discovered these large concentrations of a cyanide agent, mustard agents in the Euphrates, and the fact that our Marines have found these boxes of suspicious white powder, nerve agent, antidote, Arabic documents on how to engage in chemical warfare?
And maybe even no surprises that the UN inspection teams, Hans Blix and company, had been into some of these places and not found anything. As we get closer to Baghdad, we're going to uncover more of these things.
Colonel, a senior defense official telling Fox News at this hour that that white substance found in an industrial plant near Baghdad is not a chemical weapon.
I don't think we're just casually going to bump into something, and I could be wrong. We may in some buildings inside Baghdad, but my personal guess is, again, once we get to talk to some of these scientists and people who were tasked with hiding this stuff, we're going to be out in the desert digging some big holes where there have been things put away, or back in residences or whatever, finding stuff, little quantities, big quantities, whatever, but we are going to find it.
I want to get back to this issue that I raised just a few moments ago, and I'd asked if, you know, if Baghdad doesn't fall, do we declare victory? Because some of the things that General Meyer said yesterday indicated that that may not be a concern, and they may declare victory even if the whole country is not secured. Do you negotiate a surrender? Is there any negotiation, or is it just simply a declaration at some point that we are now in control? Do we have to talk to anybody on the other side?
Secretary Rumsfeld has been pretty clear, I think, Alan, about saying there will be no surrender. There are no terms of anything. I think it's a death. It's a duel to the finish, without a doubt. But when we talk about really declaring victory, we probably, hand in hand with declaring that, really need to show some kind of a provisional government. A lot of discussions going on in town here the last few days between the White House, Pentagon, and State Department about establishing a provisional government so that indeed when we declare victory, we can really have the rest of the world look and see, okay, who's the replacement for Saddam? It's not just some American that's walking in and taking over things. It's really some provisional government, a real legitimate Iraqi leader there, somebody that somebody that people can look to.
We want to show a structure. Thank you very much, Colonel Cowan. As always, thanks for your expertise tonight on Hannity and Combs.
Thanks, Alan. Nice to be with you.
And thank you very much. Let's go to Washington. Let's check in on what Greta Van Susteren has coming up next. Right after Hannity and Combs, of course, it's On the Record. Greta, what do you got? What are you looking at tonight?
Dr. Henry Kissinger is going to be here. Alan?
Thank you very much, Greta.
Thanks, Greta. During a speech, by the way, in New Hampshire, presidential hopeful Senator John Kerry told the crowd earlier this week that we not only need a regime change in Iraq, but we need one here in the United States. When he's making outrageous statements about the president, when he says he has a breach of trust, and what he said about regime change. Regime change, that doesn't happen in America. We have elections in America. Regime change involves the removal of a tyrant or a dictator.
He has no idea what the word freedom really means. Let me ask you, you know, in the early years of my adult life, the many years, and there were a lot of them, I never looked at anybody else and thought they should be paying for anything that I own or have in life in any way. Have we grown a portion of this society that feels that entitled, that they want to empower and embolden their government to take from this group of people and redistribute it to that group of people? In other words, have enough Americans now bought into this redistribution, capitalism, socialism model? Is that now a prevalent point of view? Have I missed the boat on this?
When I was growing up, if I saw someone, I remember the first time I saw someone with initials on their shirt, on the sleeves of their shirt. I said, I can't wait to make money, I'll do that. All my shirts have that, right? It's just something I wanted to do. It's just one of these drivers. When my daughter was born, my first child, don't you know how hard I worked? That's all the motivation I needed.
You know, a couple of things. In the years when I needed jobs, and I never got hired by a poor person in my life, I got hired by people that could afford to pay me. Two characteristics. Every wealthy person I've ever met in my life, they have two qualities that are consistent. One is they're smart, and two, they're hardworking. I would imagine the smart part of them is going to start exiting California if they try to implement this quickly. Agree or disagree?
I agree.
You agree with us?